I've had a number of requests to do several different kinds of videos. This one is in response to a number of those requests. As for the rest of them, I've made a list in the description that I'm trying to work towards. If yours is not in the list, feel free to leave a comment to remind me. I can't make any promises of which ones I'll get to and when, but I'll try to keep you updated on that. So I wanted to make sure that you all knew I had not forgotten you. This video is in response to requests to talk about the functions in greater detail, and also to provide more illustrative examples, more concrete examples, and also to discuss the functions in relation to philosophy. I'm going to try to tackle all three of those in this video and in the next two videos. So this one is about introversion and extroversion, as the title says, and then I'll do a video on rational functions and a video on irrational functions. I also want to let you know that, as you've probably already guessed, I do not have all of my Jungian typology knowledge just already present in my brain, and I'm just slowly pouring it out to you bit by bit. This is very much a learning process for me too, so thank you for your patience with that. I'm constantly afraid that I'm going to contradict myself in the past and not realize it. Thankfully it doesn't seem like I've done that, at least no one's called me out on it, so I'm pretty sure. But if you want to know what I'm thinking at this point in time, then you look at my most recent videos. If you don't like that and you like an idea I had before, hopefully nothing contradicts each other and it's all just different perspectives on the same thing. But thank you for your patience, and I'm glad these have been useful to you. I'm now going to press forward to introversion and extroversion. Thank you. So like I've said before, extroversion is focused on objects and objective things, while introversion is focused on the subject and subjective things. So what do I mean by that, though? Well, let me give an illustration. Let's say that there are two explorers out on a safari, and each has been given a very different task for recording their observations of the local fauna. The one explorer is tasked with making purely objective observations, the other with making entirely subjective observations. Now, let's say that both explorers encounter some strange new species of animal. The objective explorer, who is trying to be purely objective, would write down only what the animal itself looks like, divorced from any of his own personal biases, interpretations, or feelings from the experience. He makes sure that none of his own personal feelings or ideas leak into his observations. For instance, he may personally think and feel that the creature is a horrible-looking thing and suspects that this represents the way an animal stays alive, how that affects its physical beauty, or it's something like this. But he knows that if he were to include those kinds of ideas and interests in his observations in the report, then the board of directors who he's presenting to would read it and say, well, that's all certainly interesting that you thought he was horrible and represented this idea, but that has absolutely nothing to do with the animal itself. That's just your feeling about the animal. And that's what we want to hear about. We want to hear the animal itself, not what you thought about the animal, but what the animal itself was. In other words, an objective observation is divorced from any personal feelings or interpretations, representing as much as possible of the object itself. Now, the subjective explorer has an entirely opposite task ahead of her, for what her board of directors is looking for is not a scientific, passionless, objective report, but a personal, subjective interpretation of the event. So when she examines the new species, she doesn't just let her own feelings and ideas contaminate her observations, but her feelings and ideas are her observations, the entire thing. She writes down nothing but how she personally relates to this new species of creature, how it fits into her ideas and schema that she seems to have already in her mind. Not just feelings, but ideas and theories and logic, whatever. She will not look at the creature itself. For her, that is a terrible act of creativity, of just recording what the creature itself looks like. She wants to know what the creature means for her, and thus her observations are really more of a reflection of the explorer than of the animal itself. Her observations are really her impressions of the creature, or her subjective interpretations of the creature. For instance, in her report, she talks all about how she thinks the creature appeared rather horrid, and how that seems to reflect an interesting idea about possible morality and justice in the animal kingdom, and the philosophical implications of such a thing, and how this compares with her personal values or ideas, and so on. If she were to only describe the creature and what it looked like, how it compares with other creatures, without any of her own ideas or feelings, the board would say, well, we appreciate the objective accuracy, but what we were really looking for was some creativity or a personal touch, what your experience was, to give the description some life to it. So in short, extroversion tries to work with the object without any interference from the subject, while introversion actually shields themselves from the object with the material of their subject. So as John Barnes said concerning extroverted intuition and introverted intuition in his video on the subject, extroversion, though his description is particularly true of irrational functions, but I still think the word applies in general to all of the functions, extroversion makes observations, while introversion gets impressions. Extroversion works with the object directly, while introversion always relates the object to already present psychic material and works with that. I will provide several more practical and philosophical examples now. Let's say that two children enter a plain room with a red box in the center. The girl is an extrovert, while the boy is an introvert. The girl, intrigued by the box, immediately approaches it and begins handling it, feeling it, hefting it, and seeing it for what it is. The boy is also intrigued by the box, but he stands back by the wall, not ready to actually approach the box yet, but still processing what he thinks and feels about the box, or his personal impression of the box and what he thinks the best approach would be. Now the girl, seeing that the boy is hesitant, tries to get him to approach the box with her. He protests and tries to explain that he is just trying to get his bearings first, but she doesn't quite comprehend that idea because she gets her bearings by working directly with the box, and naturally assumes that it is the same for him, and may even be annoyed at how slow he is in his thinking process, feeling that he's never going to get very far in life if he won't conquer his inhibitions and just go for it. Once he does, she thinks, he'll see much clearer than he does now. Won't get wrapped around the axle, as it were. John Barnes once again gave a very good description of this in his video on SE versus SI, where he was talking about sensation functions in particular, but I think in general extroversion learns about or works with objects by interacting with them. For instance, if extroversion wants to dance, it has to just get out there on the dance floor and try dancing, because there, in the action, it can see much clearer. So, the extroverted girl assumes that it is the same for the introverted boy. She thinks that he'll see much clearer if he just goes up to the box and works with it in real time. But the truth is, when she drags him closer to the box and expects his vision to clear up by working faster, in fact his vision clouds. His impressions get blurred and he can't process them anymore. He ends up working half blind and may get flustered and frustrated. Similarly, introversion doesn't learn dancing by going out on the dance floor, but by first watching the dance, processing its impressions of the dance, and relating those impressions to already present material, and that helps introversion get its bearings, almost like taking the time to triangulate its position on a map or something. So, the introverted boy may try to teach the extroverted girl how to sit and be patient, and think hard about the box before just running up to it. But you can't just sit still like that. She doesn't learn anything that way. Now she is working half blind. She doesn't care what she thinks about the box. She cares about what the box itself is. Although I don't want to give the impression, and this is a common error, that extroversion doesn't reflect or doesn't think, that it's sort of instinctive and in the moment. That's not what's going on here. Extroversion most certainly does reflect on its own, but it does it faster and it does it by working with the thing. Now a philosophical example, Socrates and Plato. It has been said, as John Barnes pointed out, that Socrates is a philosophy without a philosopher. Socrates' method was to discuss ideas with other people, questioning them and teasing ideas out of them, and sometimes running himself into corners and having to backtrack, but rarely, if ever, just spilling out ideas for pages and pages. One might argue that whenever this does happen, it's really Plato talking and not the actual Socrates. Furthermore, Socrates never wrote anything down himself because he believed that talking and discussing in the real world is the real thing. Once something is written down, you can't work with it in the same way. You can't question it and get answers. You can only read it, and that doesn't provide much room for objective exploration. only subjective interpretation. This, of course, is why Plato wrote a ton, because for him, you most certainly can read something and get a wealth of exploration, because Plato, the introvert, does not work with the text itself, but works with impressions that are inspired by the text, his subjective interpretation of the text, examining how the text relates to what is already within the introvert. The text is a tool the introvert can use to poke around inside themselves. But the extrovert Socrates doesn't care about what's in himself. He represents a philosophy separate from himself, while Plato represents a philosopher. Plato wrote so much because he had so many ideas and impressions within himself, and this was the best way to get them out in their pure form. When Plato thought about something, he brought his whole self into it, and had a wealth to say from his own point of view. When Socrates thought about something, he didn't have, or at least didn't offer nearly as much information from himself, but tried to explore the idea on its own to learn about it. It is ironic to me how Plato so revered Socrates' extroverted method of questioning, and yet his way of celebrating this was by writing down the alleged transcripts of Socrates' conversations. In other words, Plato loved the impressions that Socrates' method inspired in him, even though that method was a lot about getting rid of personal impressions. Try as they might, Socrates wanted to work with objects, while Plato wanted to explore and understand his subject and his subject's relation to the world. I would like to give yet another philosophical example, Jacques Derrida, an ENFP, versus Soren Kierkegaard, an INFP. I bring this one up for a specific reason, because I don't want to give the impression that extroversion as a rule doesn't like writing stuff down, because that's absolutely not correct. That was just how Socrates manifested his preference. Thus why I bring up Derrida, who was very prolific, but his overarching philosophy was still characteristically extroverted in the following manner. In essence, Derrida was concerned that people were no longer reading the classics, but instead would examine them, make a final pronouncement or interpretation of what the text truly meant, file that away, and move on to the next text. Derrida found this stifling because it meant the texts could no longer be examined and could no longer provide anything to talk about. All the energy was channeled into a set impressions instead of active observations. His project, in great part, was to encourage people to constantly reread the classics, something he himself did, and which makes up much of his corpus, objective critiques of classic works themselves from different perspectives. Either that, or his work would encapsulate his philosophy on its own, separate from Derrida, without any reference to himself or his experience and knowledge, such as works like The Postcard or Glas. Of course, Derrida is extroverted intuitive mainly, so there's that slant in interpretation, but there's extroversion there too. In contrast to this, we have Soren Kierkegaard, another prolific writer, and similar to Derrida in personality, but ultimately an introvert, because in the end he was still searching for a set interpretation of things, and was spilling onto page after page of his own impressions and his own relation to things. For instance, the majority of his works were written under pseudonyms, which each represented aspects of Kierkegaard's own character. His 3 stages of life were inspired directly by stages from his own life, and of his theological works he represented ideas which were very much a part of himself, being made up of his own psychic material, and never purely representing someone else's thoughts on the matter, but always tainting it with his own. I will be dedicating 2 more videos to this topic, one for the rational functions and one for the irrational functions, as I said before, but I will also give some brief illustrations of these functions below, just to give you a taste of that. First, extroverted feeling versus introverted feeling. In this case, a boy and a girl, being an introverted feeler and extroverted feeler respectively, are approached by a stranger who attempts to interact with them. The extroverted feeler, the girl, acts in a way that she judges most appropriate for the situation. She finds the stranger amiable, and so she seeks to respond in a way that will be most comfortable for this particular person, or at least that will have the most effective impact on the person's feelings. Thus, she is working out her judgments of value in the moment by working with the person, and is removing herself from her calculations, focusing entirely on what is comfortable for the stranger, for them. In contrast, the introverted feeler, the boy, observes the stranger with detachment at first, somewhat shy, deciding whether the stranger's manner is appealing to him. He compares and relates the stranger's actions to what he, the introvert, personally feels is pleasant or unpleasant, and very much makes it a matter of what he himself feels and knows is right. He therefore remains much less expressive than the girl, as he is not focused on how the stranger would expect him to act, but only how he feels that he should act, and much of that action is purely psychic, as it is not the boy's primary concern to influence the stranger's feelings in any way. He'll also notice certain things that the stranger does that he finds commendable, and others that are irritating to him, and these stand out as important as the boy assimilates his impressions of the man into himself and renders his judgment. Next, extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking. Let's take the same boy and girl, and they are then presented with a puzzle to solve, requiring an analysis of the puzzle's properties, rather than any questions of feeling, value, or ethics. In this case, it is the girl who demonstrates introverted thinking, being the other half of her axis, and the boy who demonstrates extroverted thinking, being the other half of his axis. Now the boy, the extroverted thinker here, analyzes the puzzle and rather quickly ascertains its particular properties and functions. He is able to determine rough categories or distinctions between parts of the puzzle, not with any sense of symmetry or balance in mind, but simply as a way to understand the puzzle and make it easier to use. With this objective understanding of the properties, he is able to form a relatively quick, efficient strategy, demonstrating a certain kind of utilitarian cleverness in solving it that the maker of the puzzle probably did not intend. Meanwhile, the girl, being the introverted thinker here, takes a very different approach. She does not analyze the puzzle on its own, but naturally relates it to her own ideas. That is, she has a definite sense of whether or not the puzzle makes logical sense to her. She doesn't just want to understand what the point A versus the point B is. She wants to understand the puzzle as a whole system, including for what intention it was built, and how it stands in relation to the girl's personal notions of symmetry and balance and so forth, so she can triangulate, as it were, its whole position and structure, and then go about solving it. Her process is thus made to function as a natural part of the system itself. She wants to build a replica of the system in her head, understanding how it stands in relation to principles and theories she already knows. Therefore, she takes longer than the boy in this case to solve the puzzle, and her process is slower, but cleaner and more natural, as its effectiveness is not just measured on getting from A to B, but on whether it is solved in the best way in relation to the system. This time, the boy and the girl are presented with a painting. I'm going to talk about extroverted sensation and introverted sensation. They are asked to examine the painting and then report on what they saw. The extroverted sensing girl pays careful attention to the painting itself and does everything she can to suppress any subjective biases or connections that might cloud her objective observations. She wants to obtain as photographic and vivid and objectively accurate an image as possible. Thus, her report on the painting is filled with direct, visceral details in an attempt to represent purely the painting itself to those listening. The introverted sensing boy goes about things very differently. He finds himself both unable and wholly uninterested in examining the painting itself on its own. To him, there is a sense that such pure objective observation is unreliable or lacking in some significant way, rather like Descartes or Kant, both INTPs with tertiary introverted sensation, who wholly mistrusted their senses' ability to ascertain the true nature of objects, rather than just a perspective. For instance, one might place a rod halfway under water. You see that it bends, but feel that it remains straight. Thus, for the introverted sensing boy, purely objective observation seems limited in its use. So, instead, he relates what he sees to already present ideas, getting a more impressionistic rather than a photographic image of the painting, creating his own interpretative vision of it, emphasizing those traits that he finds more fundamentally important in the nature of the object, rather than just those that stand out to the senses alone. Thus, the boy's report is not meant to portray the image itself, but really a reflection of the image through the boy's psyche. Finally, extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. And I have already discussed this dichotomy in several of my earlier examples, but I'm going to do it again in the spirit of fairness. Here, the boy demonstrates extroverted intuition, while the girl demonstrates introverted intuition. Both are presented with the same painting, but are specifically instructed to describe what the painting could be, rather than what it actually is right now, and let their imaginations run wild that way. The boy, being the extroverted intuitive, finds this an intriguing task because his introverted sensation naturally mistrusts the objective sensations of what the object is, but as far as what the object could be, he finds this best answered objectively. While the girl's extroverted sensation took a psychic photograph of the painting, you might say, the boy's extroverted intuition takes a kind of ghost camera photograph of the painting. By that I mean he attempts to grasp the possibilities of the painting with the same kind of matter-of-fact sharpness that the girl sought in her real-life photograph. Celebrity Types describes extroverted intuition as cognizant and chromatic. The possibilities springing from the painting are numerous, but to extroverted intuition distinguishable from each other and seen plainly visible to any acute observer, at least from the boy's perspective. The more objective he is in his observations, then the more he removes his own thoughts about the possibilities from the equation. The more accurate and likely his intuitions will be. The intuition always goes away from the subject to analyze hunches in themselves, having nothing to bind them back to the subject. They tend to branch out and go from one to many to escape subjective contamination. The girl, demonstrating introverted intuition, goes about this entirely differently. She already views the objective nature of the painting with sensation, so when it comes to intuition, she involves her own subject. To her, extroverted intuition runs into the same limitations that extroverted sensation has, according to the introverted functions. That is, such objective functions fail to comprehend the full and true nature of the possibility, only getting what the object itself wants you to see. The introverted intuitive girl naturally feels that intuitions are a matter for the deep psyche to contemplate, and are more rich and profound when they are infused and related to ideas already present in the subject. Generally, introverted intuition tries to relate things in a way to get at some grand meaning behind them. For instance, there's no door to the cafe in this painting. What does that mean? Oh, you say that the artist claimed that that was a mistake? Well, what does that mean for the art in general and symbols in art? Does it matter if the artist intended it, or can I still make the symbol? And hey, that reminds me of some subjective impressions I got while learning about Jacques Derrida, and go on from there. I hope that this video was useful to you. As always, feel free to post any questions or concerns in the comments section below, and thank you for watching.